It was one of those rare Saturdays that felt like the world had aligned perfectly. The sky was a flawless blue, the air warm but not suffocating, and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifted lazily through the cul-de-sac. For weeks, Mark had been planning this neighborhood barbecue, a way to celebrate the end of a long, stressful quarter at work and to finally bring together the people who had become more like family than neighbors. His backyard was already buzzing with the sounds of kids chasing each other, the sharp crack of soda cans opening, and the steady rhythm of classic rock humming softly from a portable speaker. The grill sizzled with marinated chicken, racks of ribs, and burgers stacked high for anyone who came hungry. What made this barbecue special wasn't just the food or the warm weather. It was the guest list. Mark wasn't the kind of man who liked to flaunt connections, but over the years, through work and personal friendships, he had come to know some influential people, city officials, a couple of high-ranking police officers, even a local judge who was more of a family friend than an authority figure. They had all been invited, along with regular neighbors who just wanted a good meal and good company. But not everyone was happy. At the far end of the street lived Karen. She was notorious in the neighborhood, the kind of person who patrolled property lines like a prison guard and reported the slightest infraction to the HOA. If a trash can was left out 10 minutes too long, she noticed. If holiday lights weren't taken down the first week of January, she complained. And when it came to gatherings, she always seemed to believe she had the authority to decide who was too loud, who had too many cars parked outside, and who was breaking what she liked to call community standards. Mark hadn't even considered inviting her. She had made it clear, more than once, that she thought barbecues were unsanitary and vulgar displays. Still, he hoped she would just stay inside, close her blinds, and ignore what was happening. But by the time the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold, it became clear that Karen wasn't going to keep quiet. From her backyard, the faint sound of a lawnmower had started up. Not because she needed to mow, it was obvious her yard was already perfectly trimmed, but because she wanted to compete with the music, drowning out the laughter with the roaring hum of her machine. When that didn't work, she dragged her trash cans out to the curb even though it wasn't collection day. She slammed her car doors, stomped loudly back and forth across her driveway, and muttered loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. Mark pretended not to notice. He wasn't going to let her ruin the day. But some of the guests exchanged glances, rolling their eyes as they caught on to what was happening. Then, as the sun fully set and the glow of string lights illuminated the backyard, Karen made her move. From behind the fence, the muffled sound of her voice carried over. She was on the phone, speaking in a clipped, exaggerated tone, making sure every word carried. She wasn't calling a friend. She was calling the police. She complained about smoke polluting the air, about unlawful noise levels, and about suspicious gatherings of too many people. She painted a picture of chaos, as though Mark's backyard was hosting a riot instead of a family cookout. For a moment, a wave of unease spread across the party. Parents glanced at their kids, unsure if they should pack up early. Mark's stomach tightened, not out of guilt, he knew he wasn't breaking any laws, but out of frustration. He had worked hard to make this day perfect, and here Karen was, trying to tear it down with a single phone call. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the guests, a city councilwoman who had been quietly enjoying her plate of ribs, leaned back in her chair with a small smile. Another guest, a police captain off duty but dressed casually like any other neighbor, chuckled under his breath. Even the local judge, sipping on a glass of iced tea, raised an eyebrow in amusement. It dawned on Mark then, Karen had no idea who was sitting just a few feet from the grill. She thought she was calling the cavalry to shut him down, but in reality, she was about to walk straight into a gathering of the very people she was trying to manipulate. The tension that had briefly stolen the joy from the evening began to shift into anticipation. Guests whispered to each other, sharing smirks and knowing looks. The kids, oblivious to the brewing drama, kept playing tag on the lawn, but the adults were bracing themselves for what they all knew was coming, a police visit. And when the sirens finally echoed faintly in the distance, Karen's victory seemed all but certain, to her. To everyone else, it was the beginning of her undoing. The flashing red and blue lights turned the corner, washing the neighborhood in sharp color. Cars slowed down to watch, and Karen stepped proudly out onto her driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed, ready to point out the so-called offenders. But little did she know, the moment those officers stepped into Mark's backyard, her smug smile would crumble. Because tonight, the guest list was her biggest mistake. The patrol car rolled to a slow stop in front of Mark's house, its headlights cutting through the dusk. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off windows up and down the street, drawing curious neighbors out onto porches and lawns. Karen stood tall at the edge of her driveway, arms folded, her posture dripping with self-satisfaction. To her, this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she could finally prove that Mark's gathering was a disturbance and that she, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood, had been right all along. The officers stepped out, 2 of them, their uniforms crisp, their expressions neutral as they scanned the scene. From where they stood, nothing looked out of order. The music wasn't blaring, it was soft background noise. The kids weren't causing havoc, they were laughing and playing tag in the yard. The smoke from the grill rose gently into the air, no thicker than 100 other barbecues they'd seen before. It looked like what it was, a normal backyard cookout. Karen wasted no time. She marched toward the officers, gesturing dramatically toward Mark's house as if she were presenting evidence of a crime scene. Her words tumbled out in a rush, complaints of smoke, noise, trespassing cars, and unauthorized gatherings. She spoke with the certainty of someone who believed her every word was law, her tone sharp and accusatory. The officers listened politely, nodding in the way trained professionals do, but their eyes kept drifting back to the yard, to the rows of smiling faces around the tables, to the children darting through the grass, to the food sizzling on the grill. Nothing about the scene matched the chaos Karen was trying to describe. When they finally stepped into the backyard, the party grew quiet. Conversations lowered, forks hovered mid-air, and all eyes turned toward the uniformed figures walking slowly past the fence. For a moment, a thin veil of tension settled over the crowd. But then, the mood shifted. The off-duty police captain, still in his casual clothes but instantly recognizable to the officers, rose from his chair with a friendly wave. Recognition flickered in their eyes, followed by a sudden shift in posture, professional but unmistakably respectful. He wasn't just a colleague, he was a superior. Behind him, the city councilwoman stood, setting down her plate of ribs and offering a polite nod. The judge, seated calmly with his glass of iced tea, tilted his head slightly, his presence commanding attention even without a word. The officers froze for just a second, realizing exactly who they were looking at. This wasn't just a backyard barbecue. This was a gathering of some of the most influential people in the city, people whose authority extended far beyond a petty noise complaint. Mark could see the realization dawn on them, and the corners of his mouth curled into the faintest smile. Karen, however, was oblivious. She had followed the officers into the yard, her voice still rising above the quiet crowd as she repeated her accusations. She pointed at the grill, at the tables, even at the kids running in circles, as though each was evidence of wrongdoing. Her confidence grew louder with every word, convinced that the officers were moments away from shutting everything down. But then, one of the officers turned toward the captain. Respect in his tone, he asked quietly if everything was all right. The captain's easy smile said it all. He explained that it was just a neighborhood cookout, perfectly within the law, and that everyone was simply enjoying themselves on a Saturday evening. Karen's face faltered. The smirk she had worn so proudly began to crack. She stepped forward, insisting they had to issue citations, that the smoke was unhealthy, that the noise was disturbing the peace. Her voice wavered slightly now, but she pressed on, desperate to maintain control of the situation. That was when the councilwoman spoke, her voice calm but firm, carrying the kind of weight that made people stop and listen. She reminded the officers, and everyone within earshot, that community gatherings were not only allowed but encouraged, that nothing illegal or disruptive was happening here, and that the only disturbance was the neighbor attempting to weaponize the system for her own grievances. Karen's mouth fell open, but no words came out. For the first time, she realized she wasn't in control. The judge then cleared his throat, adding a few choice remarks about frivolous complaints and misuse of public resources. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was cutting enough that Karen's cheeks flushed red. The officers shifted uncomfortably, caught between protocol and the undeniable authority surrounding them. The children, still playing on the lawn, seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. But the adults weren't. They exchanged glances, quiet chuckles, and murmurs of disbelief as they watched Karen's carefully constructed power trip collapse in real time. The officers, maintaining their composure, finally addressed the crowd. They stated clearly that no laws were being broken, no disturbance was occurring, and that the gathering was perfectly fine. With a courteous nod to the captain, the councilwoman, and the judge, they excused themselves, making it clear that their presence had been unnecessary from the beginning. Karen stood frozen, her mouth tight, her fists clenched at her sides. This wasn't the victory she had envisioned. She had expected the barbecue to end in humiliation for Mark, with citations, angry neighbors, and police shutting everything down. Instead, the humiliation belonged entirely to her. As the officers walked back to their car, the party atmosphere slowly returned. Music drifted back into the air, conversations resumed, and laughter spread again. But there was a new energy now, one fueled not just by food and fun, but by the unspoken knowledge that Karen's power had been broken, at least for the night. Mark took a deep breath, letting the relief wash over him. He knew Karen wouldn't give up so easily. People like her never did. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. Because if tonight had shown him anything, it was that Karen was willing to go further than anyone expected. And Mark would need to be ready for what came next. The following morning, the barbecue felt like a dream. Mark's backyard still smelled faintly of smoked ribs and charcoal, and the laughter from the night before echoed in his mind. It should have been a memory to savor, a perfect gathering of family, friends, and unexpected allies. But as he stepped out onto his porch with a fresh cup of coffee, reality set in. Karen was already outside. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't making small talk, and she definitely wasn't pretending to be a good neighbor. Instead, she was pacing her driveway with a clipboard in hand, scribbling furiously, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Every few minutes, she'd glance toward Mark's house, her expression filled with venom. Mark knew that look. Last night hadn't humbled her, it had ignited her. By noon, the first letter arrived. An envelope, stamped with the HOA's logo, slid neatly into his mailbox. He tore it open, his stomach tightening with every line. According to the letter, he was in violation of multiple HOA rules: excessive noise, smoke pollution, unsanctioned gatherings, and even unauthorized lawn damage, from where the kids had run in circles. The HOA was threatening him with fines, escalating penalties, and, if the violations continued, potential legal action. Mark shook his head in disbelief. It was obvious who was behind this. Karen hadn't gotten her way with the police, so now she was pulling strings with the HOA. But what unsettled him most wasn't the letter itself. It was the speed. The next day, another notice arrived. This one wasn't just a fine, it was a summons to appear at the next HOA meeting, where his pattern of violations would be addressed publicly. Karen was escalating the fight to a stage where she thought she couldn't lose. The HOA meetings were her arena, a place where she thrived on intimidation and manipulation. There, surrounded by board members she had spent years influencing, she expected to crush Mark once and for all. But Mark had other plans. He reached out quietly to a few of his barbecue guests, the councilwoman, the captain, the judge. He didn't ask them to fight his battle for him, but he wanted them to know what was happening. To his surprise, they didn't just sympathize, they offered guidance. The captain reminded him of his rights, the councilwoman explained how HOA bylaws could be challenged, and the judge hinted at the importance of keeping everything documented. For the first time since the letters began, Mark felt the tide shifting. Karen thought she had cornered him, but in her arrogance, she didn't realize he was gathering something she never expected: proof, allies, and a plan. As the day of the HOA meeting drew near, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. People whispered about what might happen, some eager to see Karen finally taken down, others fearing her wrath if she came out victorious. The stage was set, the battle lines drawn, and Karen was sharpening her claws for the fight of her life. But Mark wasn't stepping into that meeting unprepared. He was walking in with something stronger than Karen's endless complaints. He had the truth, and the power of those who had seen her games for what they were. And when the HOA doors opened, everyone would see who really held the power. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to taste. The community hall, usually a quiet space for announcements about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules, was buzzing with anticipation. Folding chairs lined the room, and neighbors filled them one by one, whispering nervously about what was about to unfold. At the front of the hall sat the HOA board, a row of serious-looking faces behind a long table. They had gavel, stacks of papers, and the familiar air of people who believed their rules carried the weight of law. And right in the center of the front row sat Karen, her clipboard balanced on her lap, her pen poised like a sword. She looked smug, certain that this was her arena, her chance to finally crush the man who had defied her vision of control. Mark walked in calmly, a folder tucked under his arm. His heart pounded, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had prepared for battle. He had documents, photos, and video evidence, all meticulously organized. But more than that, he had something Karen could never match: integrity, and the truth. As he took his seat, a hush fell over the room. Everyone knew why they were there. The agenda had been circulated earlier in the week, and at the top of the list in bold letters was "Violation Hearing, Mark Davis, Unauthorized Gatherings, Noise Disturbances, and Property Damage." The chairperson called the meeting to order, tapping the gavel sharply against the table. The routine business came first, but no one was paying attention to budget updates or landscaping proposals. All eyes kept drifting back to Karen, who sat with her arms crossed, and to Mark, who sat quietly, waiting his turn. Finally, the chairperson cleared his throat and addressed the matter at hand. Karen was invited to present her complaints. She wasted no time. Rising from her seat, she launched into a tirade that seemed rehearsed, her voice rising and falling with. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to taste. The community hall, usually a quiet space for announcements about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules, was buzzing with anticipation. Folding chairs lined the room, and neighbors filled them one by one, whispering nervously about what was about to unfold. At the front of the hall sat the HOA board, a row of serious-looking faces behind a long table. They had gavel, stacks of papers, and the familiar air of people who believed their rules carried the weight of law. And right in the center of the front row sat Karen, her clipboard balanced on her lap, her pen poised like a sword. She looked smug, certain that this was her arena, her chance to finally crush the man who had defied her vision of control. Mark walked in calmly, a folder tucked under his arm. His heart pounded, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had prepared for battle. He had documents, photos, and video evidence, all meticulously organized. But more than that, he had something Karen could never match: integrity, and the truth. As he took his seat, a hush fell over the room. Everyone knew why they were there. The agenda had been circulated earlier in the week, and at the top of the list in bold letters was "Violation Hearing, Mark Davis, Unauthorized Gatherings, Noise Disturbances, and Property Damage." The chairperson called the meeting to order, tapping the gavel sharply against the table. The routine business came first, but no one was paying attention to budget updates or landscaping proposals. All eyes kept drifting back to Karen, who sat with her arms crossed, and to Mark, who sat quietly, waiting his turn. Finally, the chairperson cleared his throat and addressed the matter at hand. Karen was invited to present her complaints. She wasted no time. Rising from her seat, she launched into a tirade that seemed rehearsed, her voice rising and falling with exaggerated passion. She described Mark's barbecue as a wild, disruptive event, claiming the smoke endangered air quality, the music disturbed the peace, and the crowd posed a safety risk. She even waved photos she had taken, pictures of cars parked neatly along the curb, of children playing on the lawn, of Mark's grill smoking harmlessly in the evening air, as though they were damning evidence of criminal behavior. The board listened attentively, nodding along as Karen spoke, her years of influence clear in the way they indulged her every word. When she finally sat down, smug satisfaction radiated from her face. To her, the case was airtight. Then it was Mark's turn. He rose slowly, placing his folder on the podium, and for a moment the room was silent. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't try to match Karen's theatrics. Instead, he began methodically, presenting his evidence one piece at a time. First, photos of the barbecue, tables set neatly, children supervised, music playing at a modest volume. Next, the video recording he had made, complete with decibel readings from his phone app showing the noise level never exceeded what was allowed under city ordinance. Then, copies of HOA bylaws, highlighted to show there was no rule against gatherings of neighbors on private property. The board shifted uncomfortably as he spoke, their certainty wavering. Neighbors leaned forward in their chairs, murmuring to one another as the tide began to turn. And then, Mark presented his trump card. A printed log of every notice and fine Karen had orchestrated in the past week, each one disproven with evidence. Photographs of his yard proving his furniture was properly stored. Documents showing his grill met safety standards. Even time-stamped videos disproving her claims of property damage. But he didn't stop there. With calm precision, Mark revealed the pattern. Karen's harassment extended far beyond his barbecue. He had quietly gathered testimonies from other neighbors, people who had been fined for petty reasons, targeted with fabricated complaints, or intimidated into compliance. Their statements painted a picture of Karen not as a protector of community standards, but as a bully abusing the system for personal power. The murmurs grew louder. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, Karen's smug expression faltered. And then came the moment that sealed her fate. From the back of the room, the city councilwoman stood. She hadn't come as an invited guest, she had come because she lived in this community too. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. She reminded the board of the importance of fairness, of the danger of allowing one individual to weaponize the HOA for personal vendettas. She spoke not as a politician, but as a neighbor who wanted peace restored. The police captain, seated quietly in the back, nodded in agreement, his presence alone reinforcing the seriousness of her words. And when the judge cleared his throat and reminded the board of the legal liabilities they could face if they continued enabling harassment, the silence in the room was deafening. Karen tried to interject, her voice shrill, but the damage was done. The board no longer looked at her with respect. They looked at her with suspicion, even resentment. The chairperson tapped the gavel again, his voice strained as he announced that the board would review the matter further. But everyone in the room knew what that meant. The tide had turned. Karen had lost her grip. Mark sat down, his folder closed, his heart pounding. He hadn't just defended himself, he had exposed the truth. The room buzzed with whispers, neighbors exchanging glances filled with relief, some even with quiet admiration. Karen, red-faced and shaking, gathered her papers in a fury. Her plan to humiliate Mark had backfired spectacularly. She hadn't silenced him. She had only revealed herself for what she truly was. But as she stormed out of the hall, Mark knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't accept defeat easily. If anything, this would only fuel her obsession. The real question was, how far was she willing to go to get back at him? The weeks following the HOA meeting felt strangely calm. The constant stream of letters stopped arriving, the fines halted, and the neighborhood began to breathe again. For the first time in months, Mark could step onto his porch without spotting Karen scribbling notes or snapping photos. Neighbors smiled more openly, their conversations lighter, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from the cul-de-sac. But Mark didn't trust the silence. He had lived near Karen long enough to know she wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. She thrived on control, on conflict, and on the satisfaction of bending others to her will. Losing at the HOA meeting had been a public humiliation, and Karen wasn't someone who let humiliation go unanswered. Sure enough, the storm returned. It started subtly. Mark's trash cans were mysteriously knocked over during the night, their contents strewn across his driveway. Packages left on his porch vanished, though his camera caught only fleeting shadows that could never be clearly identified. Small scratches appeared on his car, as though a key had been dragged along its side. Mark suspected Karen, but she was clever. Nothing directly tied her to the incidents. She had learned to operate in the shadows, creating chaos without leaving fingerprints. Then the whispers began. Neighbors mentioned receiving strange phone calls, anonymous tips claiming Mark was running dangerous activities from his home. A few even admitted they'd been warned not to associate with him. The smear campaign was obvious, but it was working. Though many stood by him, others kept their distance, wary of being caught in Karen's crosshairs. Mark's frustration grew, but he stayed calm. He had documented everything, every incident. She had learned to operate in the shadows, creating chaos without leaving fingerprints. Then the whispers began. Neighbors mentioned receiving strange phone calls, anonymous tips claiming Mark was running dangerous activities from his home. A few even admitted they'd been warned not to associate with him. The smear campaign was obvious, but it was working. Though many stood by him, others kept their distance, wary of being caught in Karen's crosshairs. Mark's frustration grew, but he stayed calm. He had documented everything, every incident, every rumor, every suspicious act. Still, Karen seemed to be one step ahead, always careful, always just out of reach of consequences. And then came her boldest move yet. Late one evening, as Mark prepared to turn in, flashing lights returned to the street. Another police car pulled up, this time with more urgency than before. Mark's heart sank as he opened the door to find officers explaining they had received a report of illegal activity on his property. Someone had called in a tip about drug dealing, a serious accusation that demanded immediate response. Karen stood across the street, arms folded, a faint smile playing on her lips as she pretended to water her flowers. The officers were professional, but firm. They had to investigate. Mark cooperated fully, showing them his spotless home, his neatly kept yard, and the only substances on the property, bags of charcoal by the grill. The search ended quickly, and the officers apologized, noting it was likely a false report. Still, the humiliation was real. Neighbors had gathered outside, watching the scene unfold. To them, it didn't matter if it was a mistake, the image of police searching his home was enough to plant doubt. Mark knew then that Karen had crossed a line. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was character assassination. And if she was willing to make false reports of criminal behavior, there was no telling how far she would go next. But Karen had made a critical mistake. Unbeknownst to her, one of the officers on the call recognized Mark from the barbecue weeks earlier. He remembered the judge, the councilwoman, the police captain who had all been present. Quietly, he passed word along. Soon, the same network of allies who had stood by Mark before were aware of Karen's escalation. The city councilwoman called him personally, promising that this kind of abuse wouldn't go unchecked. The judge reminded him that filing false police reports was a crime with serious consequences. And the captain assured him that the department was beginning to take note of the pattern of calls tied to Karen's address. For the first time, it wasn't just Mark gathering evidence. The system itself was turning its gaze on Karen. Still, Mark remained cautious. He knew the coming weeks could be the most dangerous yet. A cornered opponent was always the most unpredictable, and Karen was now more cornered than ever. She had lost her influence in the HOA, her petty fines had been dismantled, and her smear campaign was unraveling. The only power she had left was desperation. And desperation could be deadly. As Mark sat on his porch that night, the quiet hum of crickets in the background, he thought of his family, his neighbors, his home. Karen had declared war, but wars didn't last forever. Sooner or later, the truth prevailed. And Karen's truth was about to catch up with her. The weeks that followed Karen's false police report were tense. The neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Some neighbors openly avoided her, no longer fooled by her theatrics, while others still clung to her side out of fear of becoming her next target. Mark stayed vigilant, documenting every suspicious incident, knowing the moment was coming when all of Karen's schemes would finally catch up to her. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. One cool Friday evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops and the streetlights flickered on, the neighborhood was startled by the sight of police cars pulling up once again. But this time, they didn't stop in front of Mark's house. They stopped in front of Karen's. Confused whispers spread quickly as neighbors emerged from their homes. Karen stormed out of her front door, protesting loudly, waving her arms in dramatic fury. But her voice carried no authority now. The officers were firm, their words sharp, their patience thin. After weeks of bogus reports and wasted resources, they had finally gathered enough evidence. Karen had filed multiple false reports against Mark, serious accusations that not only endangered his reputation but also diverted law enforcement away from genuine emergencies. The police had tracked the calls, connected the dots, and confirmed what Mark and others had long suspected: Karen was behind every one of them. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as Karen was handed a citation, her voice screeching as she insisted she was the victim, that she was just trying to protect the community. But the officers didn't waver. They explained that her actions carried consequences, that false reports weren't a game, and that her record would now reflect the seriousness of her harassment. Mark stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, his expression calm. He didn't cheer, didn't gloat, he didn't need to. The sight of Karen finally being held accountable was satisfaction enough. For months, she had terrorized the street, twisting rules, manipulating the HOA, and abusing law enforcement. And now, the system she had tried to weaponize had turned against her. But the fallout didn't stop there. At the next HOA meeting, word of Karen's actions spread like wildfire. The board members, already weary of her antics after Mark's evidence, voted to remove her from any position of influence within the association. Her constant complaints were no longer taken seriously, and the power she once wielded so freely evaporated almost overnight. Neighbors who had once feared her began to speak out. Stories surfaced of petty fines, manipulative threats, and years of bullying that had gone unchallenged. Freed from her shadow, the community began to rebuild, finding camaraderie in their shared relief. Mark's reputation, once tarnished by Karen's lies, was restored in full. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now approached him with gratitude, thanking him for standing firm, for not letting Karen's reign of control destroy their neighborhood. And as for Karen, her once proud strut was gone. She kept her blinds drawn most days, avoiding the stares and whispers of those she had wronged. The clipboard she once carried like a badge of authority gathered dust somewhere inside her house. Her reign as the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood was over, undone by her own arrogance. On a warm Saturday afternoon, months after the chaos had ended, Mark hosted another barbecue. The grill smoked gently, music played softly, and laughter filled the air. Neighbors brought side dishes, kids played on the lawn, and the atmosphere was light, free, and full of the kind of peace the community hadn't known in years. This time, when the smell of ribs drifted down the street, Karen's house stayed dark and silent. No phone calls, no complaints, no interruptions. Just silence. Mark glanced around at the smiling faces of his guests, the councilwoman chatting with the judge, the captain laughing with a group of neighbors, kids chasing each other across the yard. He took a deep breath, the tension of the past months finally leaving him. Karen had tried to ruin his life, to strip him of his peace and dignity. But in the end, her obsession had destroyed only herself. The neighborhood had learned an important lesson, that bullies only thrive when people stay silent. And once someone stands up, once the truth is brought into the light, even the most powerful, Karen, can be brought down. As the sun set over the cul-de-sac, the glow of string lights flickering to life, Mark raised his glass in a quiet toast, not just to victory, but to resilience, to community, and to the sweet taste of justice served hot off the grill. Karen's story was over. And the neighborhood's was just beginning.